I'd like to thank you for taking the time today to review Revenue and Expense Deferrals. The Revenue and Expense Deferral module is developed by a company called Systronics, who are based out of Dubai and have been developing for Sage 300 ERP for over 30 years. What sets them apart from some of the other third-party developers is their products are 100% written in the SDK, which means these modules have the same look and feel as your Sage 300 ERP modules have, and we support a lot of the features that are available in Sage 300 ERP. Things like import-export, multi-currency, as well as the optional fields module. So the Revenue and Expense Deferral module will make you Sarbanes-Oxley compliant, and it does come pre-configured for order entry, accounts receivable, as well as the general ledger. However, this module can be configured to pick up transactions from any 100% SDK module. All of the processing logic for Revenue and Expense Deferrals is actually based on the GL module. Transactions must be posted in the general ledger to be picked up by Revenue and Expense Deferrals, and those transactions get picked up based on an optional field. You can do just revenue, just expense, or both types of transactions. My name is Nancy Lavery, and we represent Systronics here in North America, so we are a local resource for this product. A deferral transaction would be something where you recognize the revenue or the expense after cash has been received or put out. So an example of unearned revenue would be where you've received funds for services that have not yet been performed, or a prepaid expense would be a case where you've made payments for goods or services, but you have not yet received those goods or services. An example would be an insurance where you pay $12,000 for the entire year, but you don't want to actually consider that as a full expense all at the beginning of the year. So you can actually spread that over the entire year. So a transaction like that, upon deferral of the transaction, you would debit the deferred expense account and credit the original account. As I mentioned, these transactions must be posted in the GL, so they will affect the original account initially. Upon recognition, you will then credit the deferred expense account and debit back to the original account. And as we get into the features, I'll explain that you actually have an option of not having it go back to the original account. There are multiple deferral methods that are available in this product. You can do straight line deferrals, where of course it would be an equal amount for each period throughout the deferment period. You can do declining balance type transactions, where it would be a percentage of the remaining amount gets recognized over time. Or you can create manual recognition schedules. So an example of that would be where perhaps you would like to have skip months in the middle of your schedule. There's multiple periods that are available with Revenue and Expense Deferrals. You can do calendar or fiscal year, calendar or fiscal quarter, monthly, by fiscal period, weekly, and even daily. I'm going to leave this slide presentation right now, and we'll go have a look at the software, and I'm going to come back and refer to this screen at some point when we get to the feature within the software. So Revenue and Expense Deferrals, you can see the module sits in the tree with all of the other Sage 300 ERP modules, and we do actually embed ourselves up under the administrative services of Accpac or Sage 300 ERP. So you can set parameters for this module by user as you can with any other of the Sage 300 ERP modules, which means you can pick and choose the type of access that a user will have to this module. Under the setup features of Revenue and Expense Deferrals, under the options, you can begin to make some choices as to how you would like transactions to be treated by this module. Under the features and optional fields is where you will determine which type of deferrals you will be doing, whether they're straight line, declining, or manual deferrals. And I should mention that Revenue and Expense Deferrals, I think I mentioned, it will pick up transactions based on the optional fields. So as you make the choices to the types of deferrals that you want to do, the table will be built in the background that will create the optional fields that are required to pick up these transactions. So you do not need to configure the optional fields module. However, you may notice that the top portion of this screen has been grayed out. And the reason being, as you make these choices, it will create the table for optional fields in the background, which means that once you've made a choice and saved it, you cannot go back and remove that feature. You certainly could make a choice for one type of deferral method and come back at a later date and choose an additional deferral method. You just cannot remove those features once you've saved them. There is a template feature that will allow you to predefine parameters for specific types of transactions and then pull in all of the optional fields with one keystroke in terms of bringing in a template. And I will show you that in a bit more detail. You must choose at least one deferral method to activate this software. On the right-hand side of the screen, I can start to make some additional choices as to how I would like transactions to be handled. Whether or not I'd like to be able to put transactions on hold, and if I do want to put transactions on hold, then I may want to be able to auto-release those transactions based on specific information. I can choose to delay my first recognition, and then I can choose whether or not I would like to override either the deferral account or the deferral amount within an individual transaction. And what I mean by that is, under the Accounting tab, we're going to set defaults for your deferred revenue account and your deferred expense account. So those will be default. If no other parameters are around a transaction, those will be the accounts that are used. So that feature on the first screen refers to whether or not you want to allow users to make changes to that deferral account. You also need to specify the transaction or the source codes, and this would be, if you're familiar with the general ledger, each module is represented by the source code. Under the Source Codes tab is where you will define the types of transactions that you want revenue and expense deferrals to pick up. So in my case, I only have accounts receivable in the general ledger here. However, I could simply click on the Finder and I can bring up a list of all of the available transactions that can be picked up by revenue and expense deferrals. So you can see accounts receivable, the bank. I can scroll through this list and show you that all of the modules are available here. And quite frankly, we can actually pick up transactions from any module that is written in the SDK. Under the Processing tab is where you can start to add in some additional information. It will track the next deferral number for you, and this deferral maximum interval refers to a time frame. Now, if I'm running my deferrals on a monthly basis, I would probably put something like 35 days here. And what this does is it will produce a warning for users if they are running the deferral process more than 35 days from the last time you ran the deferral. You can see the last deferral date here, as well as the last GL batch that was processed. Now that field is grayed out, which means that you wouldn't be changing it. However, there is a change button here, and that's intended to be used upon implementation of this software. You can put in the last GL batch that was processed prior to installing the software, and that will just stop revenue and expense deferrals from going back and reviewing, in this case, 269 batches. I can then choose whether or not I want to recognize transactions on the first or the last day of the deferral period, so January 1st versus January 31st. And then the post-overdue recognitions is actually the slide that I'd like to go back to because it's a little bit easier to explain when you can see an example. So the post-overdue recognitions option, if we use an example where we're posting an invoice, so we're entering the transaction in Sage 300 ERP in September 30th for a contract that actually started back in June, and I'm actually not going to run my deferrals until the end of November. So how do I want to treat that transaction? If I choose normally under this option, then all of the recognitions will go into their corresponding month, so June, July, August, and so on. And I will preface that by saying that those periods need to be open in your GL in order to do that. I could choose to transaction period, and what would happen there is it will consider when I'm entering the transaction in Sage 300 ERP. So September 30th in our example here. So it will take all of the recognitions from June, July, August, and September and put them all into the month of September. If I choose processing period in this example, then it will actually pull all of the recognitions forward and put them all into the month of November when I'm actually running my deferral. So if we go back to the software now, I can choose whether or not I want to be able to put transactions on hold, and I can choose my calculation base. And I will say again that these are default settings, but when we go and have a look at the templates in a bit more detail, I can explain to you that you can have different calculation bases based on the type of transaction. But in my case, I have a calendar month here. I could choose daily, weekly, fiscal period, calendar quarter or fiscal quarter, calendar year or fiscal year. If it's something like a month that has multiple periods, so each month has different number of days, I can set a standard duration for that as well. Then I have some choices as to a transaction that I may be entering in the beginning or in the middle of a transaction period. So in my case, if we use month as an example, then a partial period would be, maybe I'm entering a transaction in the middle of a month. So how do I want to handle that? I can skip it altogether and just say I'd rather begin my schedule at the beginning of the following month. I can say, you know what, I'm actually going to consider this month as a full month. Or you can choose to consider it partially. And you have those options for both the beginning as well as an ending partial period. Now I mentioned the system will create schedules for you, recognition schedules based on the parameters. And so for each type of deferral method, you have a choice whether or not you want to allow users to make changes to the schedule that's been created by the software. So you can say, I never want users to be able to change that schedule. I always want to leave it open and allow people to make changes to it. Or you can choose to say, I'm going to allow people to make changes to that recognition schedule only up until the first recognition takes place. And from that point forward, I want to lock down that schedule. So those are all of the options available to you. I mentioned earlier that you don't necessarily need to recognize back to the account that something has been deferred from. So I'll just remind you, all transactions must be posted through to the general ledger, at which point they'll get picked up by revenue and expense deferrals. So they will hit an initial account, and then the system is defaulted to recognize back to the account that that transaction came from. However, under the account sets, I can actually choose to recognize to a different account. So that option is available to you. If you have more than one deferral account in your chart of accounts, this is where you can begin to map out. If it comes from a particular GL account, then this would be the deferred revenue or the deferred expense account that I would like that transaction sent to. And lastly, the templates. So for each type of template, you can create multiple templates for different types of transactions. I'm going to use a subscription today as an example because I have my accounts receivable set up. And we'll use a one-year subscription or a one-year membership as an example today. So I have chosen my deferral method, so I'm choosing a straight line deferral method, but again, I can choose any type of deferral method for each template that I create. And then I will choose whether I want to defer it from the point that I'm actually entering it in Sage 300 ERP, or if I'm going to be putting this on hold, then maybe I want to begin that defer from at the point that it gets released from on hold. The defer to represents my deferment period. So in this case, it's a year. So I've got the transaction date plus 1 year minus 1 day. So that would be January 1st to December 31st. I'm choosing a deferment period of calendar month in this case, but again, I can use calendar fiscal year, calendar fiscal quarter, period, or by week. And this defer partially is actually different from the previous option. What this defer partially means is I don't necessarily need to defer the entire transaction. So if we use an example of $1,000, I can say I only want to defer a certain amount of that, so maybe $400 of that. Or I can say I'd rather just calculate it based on a percentage of that overall transaction. So I have the option there. I can choose to delay my first recognition, or I can choose to automatically put it on hold. So let me just show you quickly how those templates would be used. We're going to place an order today, and so I'm just going to go up to the inventory control and show you. I have an item that's called subscriptions, and I'm going to just show you how I have the template associated with the item. So under the optional fields, we can see that I have my revenue and expense deferral template. So all of those parameters that we just went over are going to be applied to any transaction that is entered using this particular item. So it can become seamless to the user if you choose to set it up this way. I'm going to be a user that's entering an order. So if you have users that are going through a process like this, they're going to just carry on with their day-to-day business. I'm going through the process here of entering an order, and I'm going to choose that particular item, our subscriptions. So far I have done nothing different from someone that's entering a standard order in Sage 300 ERP. The difference here, though, is if I scroll all the way to the end, I can see, yes, there's an optional field attached here, and here's my template. And so this pulls in all of the parameters from that template. Now you can see I could manually enter the information here as well. I could put my deferred from and to date, the period, the deferral method, and whether or not I want to be able to put it on hold. But the user that's entering this order so far has done nothing different. I can post this transaction. It will get posted up to the general ledger. And at some point, a user will come along. We're going back to Revenue and Expense Deferral now, to the Deferral Processing tab, and click this Process button. And what will happen is any transactions that have been posted in the general ledger will get picked up based on that optional field. And what will happen is Revenue and Expense Deferrals will now create a recognition schedule. Before I leave this screen, I'll show you can do reversals, and this is where you would come to manually release a transaction. But let's go have a look at what Revenue and Expense Deferrals will create. Under the Transaction Inquiry, it's an overall inquiry screen. So I'm going to fetch the information, but you can see I can select it by 4 different layers here, and I can do that based on the GL batch or based on when it was entered, or based on the source debit or the functional debit. But this gives me an overall snapshot of transactions that have been created in Revenue and Expense Deferrals. I can see the GL batch, the source entry, as well as the line number within that entry, the date, the period, where the original transaction came from. In this case, it was an accounts receivable invoice for a January subscription. Now the detail and reference, I have invoice number appearing here. However, you can configure, if you're familiar with Sage 300 ERP, you have a number of options as to the type of information you would prefer to see in this detail description and the detail reference. So I've chosen invoice number, but I want to point out that you do have options as to what type of information gets viewed in those 2 fields. Now from here I can double click and I can go into the actual details within each transaction. I can also, I'm just going to close these screens because I can also go straight to those transaction details without having to go through the inquiry screen. So the transaction details are going to show me all of the parameters that associate with a particular transaction. So again, I can see my batch entry and line number, my reference and description. You can see how important the information is that's appearing in those 2 fields, and you'll see that more so when we actually look at some of the reports. And so you want to be careful as to what information you're having populated there. I can see the source account, so the original account that this transaction was deferred from, and the source code that it was an AR invoice. And I mentioned earlier we do support multi-currency. So it will display that multi-currency information here as well. I can see the source amount as well as the rate that was used. I can then see the deferral settings. So these are all of the parameters that we viewed on the template. I can see that it was a template that was used with a straight line deferral method, the deferred to and from date, the percentage or minimum amount, that would be that partial, the calculation base that was used, and the recognition account. I can then see a table that shows me the actual schedule, and I can see within this schedule what's been recognized to date and what's still left to be recognized. And finally, under this transaction details screen, I can do attachments to a transaction. So it's just a matter of clicking and attaching any type of backup documentation to this transaction detail. I can import transactions, so that means if you have an existing environment that you're installing revenue and expense deferrals, you can import existing schedules that are midway and have revenue and expense deferrals track the balance of those schedules. So finally, we'll have a look at some of the reports that are available in revenue and expense deferral. I can, under the Audit Log Report, I can choose to see just deferral transactions, just recognition transactions, or both. And Systronics is really great at giving you multiple options as to how you would like to select information and view it within these reports. So you have a lot of flexibility. You don't have to do a lot of customized reports because you can do it straight from these screens. So the Audit Log Report will show me my batch and entry number, my reference and description, what the deferment period and method were, the start and end date of my schedule, what the original amount was, and how much has been recognized to this point in time. The Revenue Flash Report, again, I can choose summary or detail here. And I'll just show you that the Select By gives you all kinds of options as to how you would like to select the information. You can choose to include fully recognized transactions or not. But this gives you an idea of what this revenue flash looks like. My original amount, the recognitions that have taken place so far, and what the balance is of this transaction. The Deferred Revenue Report. Now this is an aging report. So I have 30, 60, 90 days here. However, you could have any type of period here. So you could run this report quarterly, you could run it yearly. It's just a matter of changing those parameters right on that screen. So it's very flexible and very user-friendly. But I can see what the original amount was, the dollar value that's been recognized to date, and what's still left to be recognized at this point. The reversal audit log, so again I mentioned you do have the ability to reverse a transaction if you so choose. Maybe a subscription gets canceled. The recognition table is actually a printed version of the transaction detail. So it is your recognition schedule in a printed form. The yes would represent things that have been recognized to date. The no's what's still left to be recognized, and the parameters around that particular transaction. And finally, you do have a report of any transactions that are currently sitting on hold. So it gives you a list of anything that is sitting on hold at this point in time, and it will give you an overall dollar value of the transactions that are currently sitting on hold. So that's revenue and expense deferrals. I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to review this module today. And I'll just leave this contact information here. If you do have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. You can also go to the Systronics website, and there is product available to be downloaded, and you can get NFR activation codes for these products as well. So thank you very much for taking the time, and have a great day.